Before history was written, it was fought in blood. This is Echoes of War. There are cities that live in history for what they built, and there are cities that live in history for what they endured. Stalingrad was not meant to be a symbol. It was a city of factories, workers, smoke rising from chimneys along the wide curve of the Volga River. Trains came and went. Steel was forged. Tractors were built. Life moved with the steady rhythm of industry. But in 1942, Stalingrad became something else. It became a name whispered in fear, a line that could not be crossed, a place where an entire war seemed to narrow into a single shattered landscape of brick, fire, and frozen breath.
By the summer of 1942, the German army had already driven deep into the Soviet Union. The early lightning victories of Blitzkrieg had carried them across vast territories. Cities had fallen, millions had been captured. To many German commanders, victory in the East still seemed within reach. But time was slipping away. The Soviet Union had not collapsed. Its factories were being moved east, beyond the reach of bombers. New armies were forming. Resistance was hardening. Hitler wanted a decisive blow. He turned his attention south, toward the oil fields of the Caucasus, the fuel that could keep his war machine alive. And on the way stood a city with a name that carried weight beyond its factories: Stalingrad, the city of Stalin. Capturing it would not only secure the Volga River, a vital transport route, it would deliver a symbolic strike at the Soviet leader himself, a propaganda victory, a psychological wound. Orders were given. The German 6th Army, supported by elements of the 4th Panzer Army, advanced toward the Volga under a relentless sun. Dust rose in endless clouds. Engines roared across dry steppe. The offensive moved with the familiar confidence of earlier campaigns. Ahead of them lay a city that did not yet know it was about to become a graveyard. In August 1942, the Luftwaffe arrived first. Waves of German bombers filled the sky over Stalingrad. Explosions tore through factories, apartment blocks, rail yards. Firestorms raged. Wooden buildings vanished in minutes. Thousands of civilians were killed in the opening bombardments. Smoke turned day into a dark, choking twilight. The city was not simply damaged.
It was broken open. But the ruins, instead of clearing the way, created something unexpected. They created a fortress. When German ground forces reached the outskirts, they expected another rapid collapse. Instead, they met defenders who had been ordered not to retreat. Soviet soldiers crossed the Volga under constant shell fire, ferried in boats at night, landing in a city already half destroyed. Many arrived with minimal equipment, thrown directly into the chaos. Behind them, political officers and blocking detachments enforced a brutal order: not one step back. Retreat was no longer an option. The battle that followed was unlike anything seen before on such a scale. It was not sweeping maneuvers across open fields. It was a struggle for individual buildings, for stairwells, for rooms.
German soldiers had a bitter nickname for it: Rattenkrieg, Rat War. Fighting happened at point-blank range. A factory floor might be held by Soviets on one end and Germans on the other, separated by piles of rubble and twisted steel. Grenades rolled through doorways. Shots were fired through holes smashed in walls. Floors collapsed under artillery fire, sending men into basements where the battle continued in darkness. The Volga flowed behind the Soviet lines, wide and exposed. German artillery and aircraft tried constantly to cut the crossing routes, to starve the defenders. Yet each night, more troops, more ammunition, more hope crossed the river under the cover of smoke and darkness. The city absorbed everything. Explosions shook the ground so often that soldiers stopped flinching.
Buildings that survived one day might be pulverized the next. Landmarks disappeared until maps became meaningless. Directions were given based on ruins: the broken fountain, the half-standing wall, the factory with the shattered smokestack. Time lost structure. Days and nights blurred into a continuous storm of noise and fear. Sleep came in minutes, in corners, under staircases, behind rubble. Food was scarce. Water came from shell holes and shattered pipes. Wounded men often lay where they fell, unreachable under fire. Yet neither side could step back. For Hitler, Stalingrad became an obsession. He ordered that the city be taken at any cost. Divisions already exhausted were pushed forward again and again. Reports of heavy losses were dismissed. Victory was declared inevitable. For Stalin, the city bearing his name could not fall.
Reinforcements were fed into the furnace, sometimes with little training, little time to understand where they were. The message was simple: hold. So they held. In places like the Red October factory, the Barricadi gun factory, and the tractor factory, the battle raged among machines built for industry, now twisted into barricades. Assembly lines became defensive positions. Steel beams and concrete walls turned into cover. Snipers became legends in the ruins. Hidden in shattered buildings, they watched streets and courtyards, turning every movement into a risk. One shot could change the balance of a sector. Patience became as deadly as firepower. The front line was not a line at all. It twisted through buildings, across streets, into sewers. At times, enemies were separated by only a few meters of debris. Voices could be heard in the dark, in a language the other side barely understood.
And still, the Germans pushed forward. By autumn, they controlled most of the city. Soviet defenders clung to narrow strips along the Volga's western bank. It seemed only a matter of time before the last resistance would be crushed. But far beyond the city ruins, something else was moving. Soviet commanders had been preparing a counterstroke. While the Germans focused on Stalingrad itself, their flanks, held by allied Romanian, Hungarian, and Italian forces, were stretched thin across open steppe. In November 1942, when winter winds began to cut across the plains, the Red Army struck. Operation Uranus. Massive Soviet forces smashed into the weaker Axis flanks north and south of Stalingrad. Defenses crumbled under the assault. Tank armies surged forward, not toward the city, but around it. Within days, the trap closed.
Der deutsche Sechstarmee, tief in Stalingrad, fand sich umzingelt. Die Hunter hatten sich zur Gejagten gewandelt. Schock rippelte durch den deutschen Kommando. Samtgeneräle irrten einen immediaten Ausbruch an, weil es noch Fühl und streng zu attempten gab. But Hitler refused. Er beorderte die 6. Armee, ihr Ground zu halten. Supplies, er prompste, würden per Air kommen. Relief Forces würden brechen durch. Der Airlift begann, but es war nie genug. Winter teiterte ins Grip. Snow covered die Ruinen. Temperaturen plunzten fabello Friesen. Aircraft struggleten durch Sturms- und Sowjetkampfwetter zu delivern food, ammunition und medical supplies. What arrived war only a fraction of what was needed. Inside the pocket, conditions deteriorated. Rations schranken. Fuel ran out. Vehicles wären abandoned. Wundete soldiers fillten cellars und bunkers zur makeshift hospitals turned. Frostbite became as deadly as bullets.
The once proud army that had crossed half of Europe now fought simply to survive another day. Soviet forces closed in slowly, tightening the ring. Artillery pounded the shrinking German perimeter. Attacks came from multiple directions. There was no safe rear, no quiet sector. Every position was temporary. Still, orders from above remained unchanged. Hold Stalingrad. By January 1943, the end was unavoidable. The pocket was split in two. Communication broke down. Ammunition was nearly gone. Men were too weak to carry their weapons for long. Some units fought on in isolated ruins, cut off from any larger plan. Others simply waited, exhausted beyond fear. On February 2, 1943, the last organized German resistance in Stalingrad ceased.
An entire field army had been destroyed or captured. The victory echoed around the world. For the first time, a major German force had been not just halted, but annihilated. The myth of invincibility was shattered in the snow and rubble of a city that had almost ceased to exist. But the cost was beyond comprehension. Stalingrad had consumed hundreds of thousands of lives.
Soldiers and civilians alike were buried beneath collapsed buildings and frozen into the earth. The city was a landscape of ruins stretching to the horizon. Yet from those ruins came a turning point. After Stalingrad, the German army would never fully regain the strategic initiative in the east. The long retreat began, measured in miles of steppe and years of relentless fighting.
Stalingrad became more than a battle. It became a symbol of endurance pushed beyond limits, of a city that refused to fall even when turned to dust, of a moment when the direction of a world war began, slowly but unmistakably, to change. Today, the name still carries weight, not because of what was built there, but because of what was endured there. Because in the shattered remains of factories and homes, humanity showed both its capacity for destruction and its refusal to surrender. In the silence that followed the guns, the wind moved through empty windows and broken walls. Snow covered shell holes. The Volga flowed on, indifferent and eternal. Winter did not arrive in Stalingrad gently.
It came like a silent executioner. The wind swept across the ruins with a sound that never stopped, a low, endless howl moving through shattered windows and hollow buildings. Snow drifted into broken stairwells, covering spent shell casings and frozen bodies alike. Weapons jammed. Metal stuck to bare hands. Breathing the air felt like inhaling knives. Hunger hollowed them out from the inside. Rations shrank to scraps. A piece of bread, thin soup, sometimes nothing at all. Horses that had survived the fighting were slaughtered. Eventually, even leather and frozen scraps were boiled in desperate attempts to create something edible. Letters from home, once treasured, became reminders of a world that no longer felt real. Time slowed. Without enough strength to attack, many units simply endured, waiting for orders that could not change reality. Rumors spread constantly. Relief forces were close. New supplies were coming. A breakout was imminent. Hope flickered, fragile and brief, before the cold crushed it again. Above them, the airlift struggled on. German transport planes flew into a sky filled with danger. Soviet fighters hunted them. Anti-aircraft fire reached up from the ground. Airfields inside the pocket shrank under artillery bombardment. Planes landed on icy strips, unloaded what they could, and took off again with wounded men crammed inside. But for every aircraft that arrived, many did not. Inside the city, Soviet forces prepared their final push. They moved carefully, methodically, using artillery to grind down resistance block by block. Loudspeakers sometimes called on German troops to surrender, their voices echoing strangely through the ruins. Few believed surrender would mean survival. Many fought on simply because they did not know what else to do. The once mighty 6th Army was now fragments. Battalions reduced to handfuls of men. Officers leading groups that barely resembled units anymore. Yet discipline, astonishingly, still held in places. Orders were followed, positions were defended. War had become instinct. Then, the end came not in one dramatic moment, but in a slow collapse. Ammunition ran out, radios fell silent as batteries died. Wounded soldiers could no longer be moved as the front line shrank around them. White flags appeared in some sectors, while gunfire continued in others. On January 31st, Field Marshal Friedrich Paulus, recently promoted by Hitler in expectation he would die rather than surrender, was captured by Soviet forces in the southern pocket. 2 days later, the northern group also ceased resistance. The guns fell quiet. After months of continuous battle, the silence felt unreal. Soviet soldiers moved cautiously through the ruins, stepping past destroyed tanks half buried in snow, past buildings that no longer had names. They found thousands of German soldiers emerging from cellars and bunkers, hollow-eyed, starving, wrapped in rags. Many could barely walk. For their survivors, captivity was the beginning of another long ordeal. For many, it would be years before they saw home again. For countless others, Stalingrad was the final chapter. Civilians who had survived the siege emerged as well. They had lived underground, in ruins, in spaces never meant for life.
They had endured bombardment, hunger, and fear with nowhere to flee. Now they stepped into a city that was no longer a city, but a field of broken stones stretching to the frozen river. Factories that once built tractors and steel now stood as skeletal frames against the gray sky. The Volga flowed beside them, carrying chunks of ice past silent docks and shattered piers. Stalingrad had become a graveyard the size of a metropolis. Yet from this devastation came a shift that reached far beyond the riverbanks. News of the German defeat spread quickly. In occupied Europe, whispers of hope grew louder. In Allied capitals, leaders saw proof that Germany could be beaten.
In Germany itself, the shock cut deep, though the full scale of the disaster was hidden from the public. On the Eastern Front, the initiative passed, slowly but decisively, to the Red Army. From this point on, German forces would fight more and more on the defensive, retreating across the same vast lands they had once crossed in triumph. The road back would be long and soaked in blood, but the direction of the war had changed. Stalingrad became a symbol, not just of victory, but of endurance beyond imagination. It shows what happens when two relentless powers refuse to yield, when ideology, pride, and desperation drive men into a battle where survival itself becomes uncertain, when a city is reduced to dust, yet still refuses to fall. Even today, the name carries a weight that few places on Earth can match.
Because Stalingrad was not just a battle, it was a test of human limits, of how much fear a person can carry, how much cold a body can endure, how much destruction a city can absorb, and still be remembered. Long after the smoke cleared, long after the snow melted into the Volga, the echoes remained. Echoes of boots on broken glass, of distant artillery rolling across the steppe, of whispered prayers in the dark. The battlefield grew silent, but history never does.